Jerker to the main card, UFC 284, the headliner of the prelims. We have Australia's comeback kid, Tyson Pedro, looking to welcome the returning comeback kid in the Cage Warriors light heavyweight champ, the Baltic gladiator, Modestas Bukauskas. And for Bukauskas, in the UFC, was a little bit of a rough run and some really weird fights. That Andreas Michailidis win, the loss to Jimmy Crute, the loss to Michael Olszejczuk by split decision.
And we all know.
And then, of course, the oblique kick that absolutely obliterated his knee against Khalil Roundtree. So Bukauskas took about a year away. And then he fought Lee Chadwick, former middleweight champ with Cage Warriors, beats him by decision. Fought Chuck Campbell, who was 5-1 in a title fight over there with Cage Warriors. Won back that light heavyweight strap. Fought like the Modestas Bukauskas that we had seen with Cage Warriors before the UFC. And then he just landed a right hook from hell in the fourth round. Face planted Chuck Campbell. Bukauskas is champ. And all of a sudden, on short notice, he comes in and replaces, and I want to make sure that I get this right, we're talking road to UFC vet Zhang Mingyang. Because Mingyang was one of those featured fighters, almost like what the PFL used to do, on road to UFC, got a win, and then they signed him to fight Tyson Pedro. It was like a lamb to the slaughter. But now all of a sudden, a fight that makes sense. Bukauskas has that UFC experience, the Cage Warriors championship lineage, and for Tyson Pedro last year, I mean, he had from 2018 to 2022 away 3 knee surgeries, all different kinds of issues with his knees after his fight with Shogun Rua. Hurt it in that fight, ACL meniscus injuries, hurt it training with Carlos Ulberg at City Kickboxing in the interim, and it really culminated with his fights against Ike Villanueva and Harry Hunsucker, both of those at light heavyweight, and he gave them their walking papers, so you gotta feel something about that.
And that's the one thing about Tyson Pedro. I feel like a lot of people would look at his last 2 wins and be like, oh, well, he was kind of supposed to beat them. And you are right, but that's the fun way that they have rebuilt Tyson Pedro, and I think they have done it the right way. It was a once promising prospect who was on the borderline of the top 15. I think he was in the top 15 at one point. Then he gets hurt, suffers some losses, some very serious injuries, and takes a lot of time off. And then they didn't just rush him right back to where he once was in the division. They didn't give him... I know Paul Craig isn't the hotness, but even like a guy like Paul Craig, that'd be a difficult matchup for pretty much anybody. That'd be a really tough fight for somebody who once had a lot of promise, and now they're coming back off all these injuries. What I do like about Tyson Pedro and how he's looked in his last 2 fights is he looked how he's supposed to. Like, he won and was dominant, got finishes, was very damaging with his strikes, and I do feel like we are getting back to the Tyson Pedro that we'd once seen before the Ilir Latifi fight all those years ago, because that was like almost a title eliminator at one point. I am not joking. Like, people were talking crazy going into that fight about how good Tyson Pedro potentially was, but again, what I do like is we are starting to see that fighter that he once was, and he is showing improvements too. Like, his striking's pretty crisp now. All the way back when he fought Khalil Roundtree, got dropped early on in that fight, his striking was very all over the place. It wasn't very technical. I'd say his technique has drastically improved ever since the time off, which is nice to see too, because some guys get injured, and a lot of that time, of course, has to be dedicated to rehab, but Tyson Pedro was definitely getting better in that time off too, and I think that's important, because for Bukauskas, it is nice to also see him get back to a closer form to what we saw pre-injury and pre his losses in the UFC. I still think, though, on short notice, this is a really difficult matchup against Pedro, but my big point I want to say with Pedro, it's like what I said with Loma Lookboonmee earlier. It's nice that you are looking better, but we have to see you look better against a real high-level 205er at a certain point. And for Bukauskas, he could be that fighter, I guess. It's just with all the time off and with the injuries, even if Pedro beats Bukauskas and looks really dominant, I wouldn't then be ready to say, oh, well, Tyson Pedro can beat a who's who in the light heavyweight division.
Yeah, it really is a weird fight because, again, for Bukauskas, Lee Chadwick has been just off the skid since he was champ with Cage Warriors. Then he missed weight and he lost the belt, and it's just, he's been with Bellator, back to Cage Warriors, weird there. And Chuck Campbell is nowhere near UFC level, and older guy, 39 years old, in that matchup. Now, Bukauskas looked really good in that fight, and he really did fight like the guy that you kind of knew coming into the UFC. And what do I mean by that? He's a karate black belt. He's and I don't know what it is. So he's a GCSD black belt. Is it Gintis Combat Self-Defense? I have no idea. So he is a karate black belt, and you see that in Bukauskas. And the one thing that you look for in Bukauskas, he kind of walks guys down. He throws singles, like 1, maybe 2 in combination, reset, walks you down. Again, you saw that big-time right hand that he landed his last time out. His takedown defense was porous, kind of leading into the UFC, but it also won him the title, and he did look really good with Cage Warriors beforehand. And for Pedro, he could capitalize on that. Now, we haven't seen the grappling, obviously, since about, 2017, 2018, but that was a hallmark of his game. I know he got caught in that straight arm lock. Remember where you were when Cowboy Cerrone fought in Singapore. I do, but in that one, he got caught in that arm lock against OSP.
Good grappler.
However, Pedro was known as a very good grappler, and his striking has certainly progressed since then. So, I do really like this matchup. Again, you got a lot of movement out of Bukauskas, which could cause some issues for Tyson Pedro trying to walk him down and land some of those power shots because Villanueva's going to get in the pocket and bang. Harry Hunsucker's going to Hunsuck it, and the guy's going to bang. So it is a different matchup that way. This fight was announced January 25th by Team Iridium that Bukauskas was going to be stepping in and taking the fight. So you look at the odds, Pedro is a pretty big favorite coming up this weekend. If we have a look at the Topology votes, surprise to us they are to you. I'm going to say over under 75% Tyson Pedro.
I think it'll be over.
I think the fans are going to go with him in this one. And it is 471 total votes, 87% Pedro, 84% by knockout. For the 13% that have Bukauskas, 63% by knockout. So the fans anticipate a knockout. I just think Tyson Pedro has the ability to kick his way in through the range and land his power shots. And if it does touch the ground, Pedro on the mat over Bukauskas.
Oh, he's a far better grappler. That's the thing that you do forget about, and I'm glad you brought it up. We haven't seen it out of Pedro his last two fights or since he's come back from injury, but he's a very talented grappler who is a really good back attacker for 205, which is a nice thing to see. So I do think he has that big advantage in the grappling of this fight. And Bukauskas lets his back get up against the cage. He does have really good movement in the open cage, but if you are able to cut him off and start to really gradually slow him down, he will get flat up against the cage. And Tyson Pedro is a very good striker when his opponents have their backs flat up against the cage. You bring up the OSP arm lock loss, but how do they get in that position? Tyson Pedro drops him with a straight shot when OSP has his back up against the cage. It's where Tyson Pedro is probably his best striking from, so I do have Pedro in the matchup. But again, even if he beats Bukauskas, we've got to see Tyson Pedro in there against a guy who's borderline top 15 or in the top 15 at some point.
And we'll see if Bukauskas can go out there with the myriad of feints that he throws. He cuts the distance with a really steady left hook as well. So look out for Bukauskas in the matchup. Both of us going with Tyson Pedro to get the win. Let us know who you have in the matchup. And then we kick off the main card, UFC 284. I mean, Jack Della's taking on Randy Brown. That's a fun fight. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.